Well, Sister Bev and I are home now. I'm recording this in advance. I'm still sitting in our hotel in Dubai. We're getting ready to head for the airports, and it's going to be good to be home. It was a great trip. Absolutely wonderful to see Israel again and see the condition of the hotels, and everything will be ready for our November tour. And then to meet the churches of Dubai and Abu Dhabi on Saturday. What a privilege, what a joy to see them, see old friends coming together, as well as a lot of new friends. But we're home now, looking forward to Wednesday night, revival night at South Campus. I'll be looking forward to seeing you there. But right now, I want us to begin to look at our devotional thoughts today about the prophet Samuel. Now, we learned two great lessons from the prophet Samuel. I want you to remember with me that both Eli and Samuel were illustrations I used in our series of sermons called Great Men of Faith, but Family Train Wrecks. And we learn a lesson from Samuel's life, and that is this. You must overcome the deficiencies of your upbringing. If you're going to be a leader, you must overcome the deficiencies in your upbringing. None of us have ever been brought up perfect. Now, I want you to remember with me. Eli, great man of faith, but family train wreck, he had horrible sons, okay? But now, when we begin to look at Samuel, we realize, okay, here is the first great prophet of Israel. Here is a man who had a great father. 1 Samuel 1 verse 21 says, the next year Elkanah and his family went on their annual trip to offer sacrifice to the Lord and to keep his vow. So he is a family man. He went with his family. He is a man who was a worshiper, and he was a man who kept his promises. He kept his vows. So he had a great father, but he was actually raised by Eli. God was grooming him and having him trained to be the first great prophet in Israel. Now, the problem with that is that Eli was not a good father. And not that he didn't love his sons, but that he put his sons before God, and he would correct his sons, but he would not enforce his correction. Now, the problem with that is that was the pattern that Samuel saw. That was the pattern of fatherhood that Samuel saw and that Samuel learned. And remember, folks, we learn from the patterns of the families we were raised in. Now, as he raises his children, 1 Samuel 8 verses 1 to 3, we see the pattern repeated. As Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons to be judges over Israel. Joel and Abijah, his oldest sons, held court in Beersheba. But they were not like their father, for they were greedy for money, and they accepted bribes and perverted judgment. So here we have, forgive me, family train wrecks repeated. Samuel did not overcome the deficiencies of his being raised and how to learn to be a father, how to learn to raise sons. And because of that, the people of Israel used it as what I call their excuse. In 1 Samuel 8 verse 5, look, they told him, you are now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. Now notice, they used his deficient sons as an excuse to rebel against the kingship of God. Now, I want you to see this because there's always an excuse and there's always a real reason that people don't want God's leadership in their life. Here, the excuse were the two boys. But I want you to notice in verses 4 and 5 of 1 Samuel 8. Finally, the elders of all Israel met at Ramah to discuss the matter with Samuel. They said, look, you're now old and your sons are not like you. Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations have. What did God say? Verse 7, do everything they say to you, the Lord replied, for they are rejecting me, not you. They don't want me to be their king any longer. Now, I want you to notice with me. These people had an excuse and they had a real reason. The real reason was they wanted to be like other nations. But their excuse was, your sons aren't very good. Now, brothers and sisters, great leadership lesson. There are times when you and I must look in ourselves and recognize, you know what? I learned some wrong patterns growing up. And because I didn't overcome them, the people will use this as an excuse to rebel against God. If we're going to be wise leaders, we have to be honest enough with ourselves to look at our upbringing and see the wrong patterns that were groomed into our lives, that were trained into our lives, and overcome those patterns. And then as we overcome those patterns, we take the excuses away from people to reject God's leadership in their life. Because bottom line, when people reject God's leadership, it has nothing to do with you. You're just the excuse. When people reject God's leadership, it's because they want to be like other nations. They want to be like everybody else. They want to fit in. So to sum up, our failures in life, because we have not addressed the deficiencies of our upbringing and the patterns that we were trained in, our failures in life are used as excuses by God's people in their rebellion and their rejection of God. Let's let the Holy Spirit teach us, and let's overcome the deficiencies of our youth, that we won't be the excuse for people rebelling against God.